Everyone. I think we'll just give a couple more seconds for people to get into the room and settled in. Okay, I think we will get kicked off because this is going to be an incredible conversation today. So I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining our webinar, Exploring Evidence-Informed Peer Support Guidelines for Veterans, Military, Public Safety Personnel, and their families. This webinar and the peer support guidelines are in partnership between the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families and the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. My name is Larissa Lamrock, and I serve as the National Strategic Advisor for Families at the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. I am truly honored to be your facilitator for today's conversation on peer support. It's a topic that's been deeply meaningful part of my life, both personally and professionally, for nearly 2 decades. To give you some context on what brings me to the table, over the years I've worked as a peer support coordinator for a national program for about 15 years. I had the privilege of serving on the board of directors for Beyond the Blue Canada. I've co-developed and facilitated peer-led psychoeducational workshops for families. I also supported the creation of these peer support guidelines we're going to be chatting about today, and I also continue to volunteer as a peer support provider. So you can see that it's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I strive to stay connected to both providing and receiving peer support. It's certainly shaped my journey in countless ways. I'm excited to share this space with all of you today. I'm hoping my mouth will start working anytime now. Hopefully it's going to kick in. And just disclosing with you, my panic for the day is that my notes are going to be fluttering all over the floor. So wish me luck that I can get through today. So first, to lead us off, as we gather virtually today, I want to begin by acknowledging that the land I'm joining from, North Bay, Ontario, is situated on the traditional territory of the Nipissing First Nation, part of the Anishinaabe Nation. This land has long been a place of healing, storytelling, and resilience. Indigenous peoples from this areas, as with many other communities, have not only stewarded the land and water, but have also served with distinction as first responders, whether in military service, firefighting, policing, or healthcare, often returning to face the invisible weight of trauma with limited support. Their experiences remind us of the deep intersections between land, service, and mental health. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which Atlas and CIPSRT are housed. The Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families is located in Ottawa on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment is situated in Regina on Treaty 4 and 6 territories of the Nahawayak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis. It's with gratitude that we offer this land acknowledgement as part of the ongoing conversation toward reconciliation. And as we hold space today for peer support, may we carry forward a spirit of respect, learning, and reciprocity, recognizing that mental wellness is not just personal, but it's collective and rooted in the histories that we all share. As well, Atlas and CIPSRT wish to acknowledge the service and sacrifices of all former and currently serving military, RCMP members, police, and other public safety personnel and families for your courage and commitment in protecting our nation. We thank you for your contributions to our country. And I'm guessing for those of you that are joining today, you continue to choose to serve if you're interested in peer support. So I thank you for your continued service to your community. I'd also like to take an opportunity, speaking of kind of peer support, is to thank the Operational Stress Injury Social Support Program and the Transition Center in good old North Bay, Ontario, for providing me some space to have this meeting with you today. I commandeered one of their offices, so I love it when supporting organizations support each other. So shout out to OSIS and the Transition Center. Thanks for, I'm playing with your pens and stuff. They might not be here when you get back. To begin with a bit of housekeeping today, today's session is being recorded and it will be available online afterwards on the Atlas and CIPSRT's websites, as well as our corresponding YouTube channels. We're going to be on YouTube, look at that. In order to limit background noise, all attendees are in listen-only mode, meaning that mics and cameras are off by default. Please use a question box to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will monitor those and try to get to as many as possible during the question period today. If you have already submitted questions in advance with your registration, then we have those reviewed and we are ready to go. This event will be presented in English with the option of simultaneous translation in French. Our translators today are Luke and Bernadette. Thank you for being here. To access this feature in your Zoom controls, click the interpretation button, followed by the language that you want to listen in. And you see the instructions on your screen. This is the agenda for today's webinar. I think coming up right any second. There we go. We'll begin with a brief presentation on the background, looking at the why and how we created these peer support guidelines. Following this, we'll have a panel discussion from our experts focusing on the content of the guidelines, and we'll take a deeper dive into implementation strategies and the next steps for these guidelines. Finally, we will conclude with a question period, so please enter those questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try our best to get around to all of them. So now I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Gabrielle Dupuis. She is the Director of Research Partnerships at the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families to provide context on these peer support guidelines before delving in with our panelists. So over to you, Gabby.
Great. Thank you so much, Larissa. And thank you, everyone, for being in attendance today. So as I'm sure we're all aware, peer support is a very important resource for veterans, military, public safety personnel, and their families. These folks are usually actually more comfortable with accessing peer support compared to other types of service because they feel understood by and more trusting of people who are inside their peer group. Additionally, in regards to access, peer support is one of the most commonly available types of services offered to these groups. However, there is no governing body or broadly agreed upon and required set of standards for the provision of peer support in Canada for veterans, military, PSP, and their families. In 2013, the Mental Health Commission of Canada did publish the guidelines for the practice and training of peer support. And while peer support for the general population does share commonalities with veterans, military, PSP, and their families, there are distinguishing features of peer support that should be acknowledged when developing and delivering a peer support program for these populations. These might include organizational culture, for example. As people build a strong sense of personal identity, camaraderie, and institutional familial ties with these organizations, they become critically important to well-being. Additionally, proactive peer support, which unlike the general population, some peer support for these groups focuses on proactive resilience building. And lastly, peer support provided in the workplace that relies on employees of the organizations as peer supporters themselves. So in 2022, Atlas and CIPSRT identified this need as it was heard loud and clear from within the community to develop peer support guidelines specific to these populations that recognize these distinguishing features. In order to develop these guidelines, Atlas and CIPSRT convened the National Peer Support Community Network, also known as the PSCN. This was a national network of 48 stakeholders from the veteran, PSP, research, family, and service provider communities that are engaged or interested in peer support. Here on the slides, you can see a snapshot of membership's background and experience in these communities. The PSCN included various lived experience perspectives, including 11 veterans, 16 public safety personnel, 14 family members, and 8 registered mental health providers. It is important to note that many members wore multiple hats, for example, being both a veteran and a public safety personnel, or being a family member and a service provider. The collective technical and experiential knowledge held among PSCN members was used at all project milestones during guideline development. The PSCN was engaged continuously throughout the process, and highlighted on the slide, you'll see an overview of the co-creation process. Initially, the PSCN were engaged ultimately to develop working definitions that would define the scope and outline of the guidelines. This included items such as defining what is a peer and distinguishing between what is formal and informal peer support. The PSCN also decided on 12 topic areas that would inform the sections of the guidelines. Evidence summaries were then created for each one of these topic areas and reviewed in advance of meetings. During these meetings, for each one of these topic areas, we used a nominal group technique, which allowed for members of the PSCN to share and then discuss, clarify, and prioritize ideas as a group. In this way, it would highlight where there were gaps and where consensus could be formed on best practices. Additionally, for areas where consensus could not be achieved, we asked members to complete 2 iterations of a modified Delphi survey to form consensus on contentious areas. Finally, a draft of the guidelines were written and designed. PSCN members reviewed and approved both the content and the design of the guidelines. Additionally, they were also sent for external stakeholder review to provide an extra set of eyes in order to further validate the guidelines. These external reviewers were also peer support stakeholders and potential end users of these guidelines. Finally, the guidelines were revised as needed, approved, and released on March 31st of this year. So now that the guidelines have launched, what we need to ask ourselves is how can we make use of them? It is important to note that the guidelines are not the end-all be-all of best practice peer support, and they're not meant to be a set of standards for training or certification. The guidelines are meant for people who are interested in peer support for veterans, military, PSP, and their families, and they're able to use them in different ways based on their perspective. For example, it can be used for people looking to develop a new peer support program. They can use the guidelines as a reference when developing protocol. It can be used for program managers and already existing peer support programs. They can use them to assess or adapt aspects of their program so they're following best practices. And it can be used for people looking for peer support. They can use these guidelines as a resource to assess appropriateness of fit. Overall, all of these perspectives can use the guidelines in a way to ensure that peer support programs are following a national evidence-informed approach. Thank you very much. I'll pass it back over to Larissa now.
Great. Thank you, Gabby. A couple of things, if I can just share, just wanted to reiterate what Gabby was saying. It resonated with me that she said it's important to know that these guidelines are not the end all, but the best, but all of the best practice peer support. So to say that this is just the beginning of this conversation, we are so thrilled that all of you folks have joined us today for your interest in participating in this conversation, and we're going to be asking you to continue to participate in this conversation. As I mentioned, I have a background in peer support, and I remember when we were leaning into the peer support community network that had developed these guidelines, we had observations right off the bat that you folks as peer supporters are a pretty passionate bunch of people. You are dedicated to the work that you do, and you're not afraid to share your opinions, and we want to continue that. I love that we are starting to come together collectively to provide the best support from the community that we are all here to support. So thank you for that, for being here today. And as I said, keep your eyes open for continued conversations around this and other things. And love that there's questions and conversation already happening in the chat. Please keep it up. Thank you. I'm happy to, I first want to thank again Gabby for the background on the project. I think that helps set context for this conversation. So whether that was new information or a refresher, we are now able to take a closer look into the guidelines themselves. So we're going to do that together with our panelists today, who I have learned a lot from each and every one of them, rather directly or a little bit more indirectly. Sid, I think you and I have traveled in similar circles, and I'm looking forward to continuing to working with you more closely in future. So without further ado, let me introduce today's panelists. Nicholas Carlton is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Regina, the director of Psychological Trauma and Stress Symptoms Lab, and a registered clinical psychologist in Saskatchewan. So thank you, Nick. Thank you for joining us here today. I'd also like to welcome Nicole. Nicole Sheeran has a PhD in neuroscience and is the owner of R2P Solutions. She was the principal consultant on the development of these peer support guidelines, and she is a wealth of knowledge now based on all of the work, and she, again, brought a lot to the table and taught me a lot. Beth Milliard is a police officer with York Regional Police. She is currently a uniformed staff sergeant overseeing a platoon. She was a postdoctoral fellow with the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment and an adjunct professor with Georgian College, Simon Fraser University, and the University of Regina. Beth was the co-chair, along with myself, for the Peer Support Community Network. Good to see you again, Beth. And our final panelist, I think a lot of folks know, Sid Gravel is a retired staff sergeant of the Ottawa Police Service. He's also a co-founder of Badge of Life Canada and the Peer and Trauma Support Systems team, and he is Canada's first director of the Global Mental Health Peer Network. Finally, Sid was a member also on the Peer Support Community Network. So welcome, Sid, and thank you to all of our panelists for being part of the webinar today. So to kick off the panel discussion, we'll start with each panelist maybe further introducing themselves in some different ways so we can put a face to the names and sharing why the topic of peer support for military, veterans, public safety personnel, and families is important to them. So again, we're going to ask why the topic of peer support, specifically for military, veteran, public safety personnel, and families is important. So Nick, can we start with you?
Sure. That was a very kind already introduction, Larissa. Thank you. I've had the privilege of working in a variety of mental health capacities, including with peer support as part of those mental health provisions that are being provided to military and veteran and first responder communities since the beginning of my training. At the OSI clinic that I did my residency at in Calgary, we had peer supporters that were just baked right in to everything that we were doing with respect to providing mental health supports. And so imagine my surprise after I left to go into private practice thereafter at the lack of a variety of things that happened thereafter. So I didn't have all kinds of supports that you get inside the OSI clinics. But the peer supporters who were there filled a great many really important roles. And after watching the incredible benefits they provided and then having those removed, when I went into private practice, you really noticed the gap. So I think that was a big part of my interest and is a part of my sustained interest. I've also had the privilege of working with some spectacular peer support leaders. I'm delighted that Sid is here. He's recognized certainly around Canada, probably internationally, as the grandfather of peer support in these areas. So I've had a lot of support there. And I think my biggest focus, and I imagine I'll get time to talk about this in a minute, actually started in 2016 when we were asked questions about the myriad of different peer support options that were available and how the evidence base could help to make decisions about what to do for peer support. So that's why I'm committed and involved in here. I also have friends and family who either have served or are currently serving. So it's baked into a lot of what I do. I'll stop there, Larissa, because that's a lot of professoring, still fairly early in some people's morning.
Thanks, Nick. And I just love what you were alluding to. I think that was the beauty of the Peer Support Community Network, is we had representatives from, research perspectives to leadership to what I refer to as the coalface of people delivering and receiving peer support. And I think that's what's leading to the peer support guidelines hitting home for some, because it's reflective of all of that. So maybe I'll hand it over to Nicole for, again, why you're involved.
Thanks, Larissa. Well, I've been working in community. I often call myself a recovering academic because I've been working in community for about 18 years now. And my area of focus has always been on translational practices. So how do you take what we know about a particular area or approach or something and turn that into what we do for people on the ground, recognizing that, coming from having grown up in a research background where we're all kind of taught that the end users of research are your next door neighbor researcher, the person you collaborate with, but recognizing that actually, no, we need to get information on the ground in ways that are useful for people. And certainly peer support has really grown significantly over the past many years in a lot of different areas, not just within the particular population that we have today. But I'm the chair of the board for a large organization here in Calgary, and we've been using peer supporters within our housing programs for many years now because they finally got some support to fund that particular approach. And it's been highly beneficial for people who maybe don't have as much access because they live in poverty, they're disadvantaged in some way to other kinds of supports and services. So it's important to me from that perspective, but I'll just sort of end on a personal note and say that I do have a number of close family members who have served in the military or within policing, and two of them came back from certain experiences fundamentally changed. And I know that peer support was a big part of what helped them get back into a better place So it's certainly important to me from that perspective as well. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nicole. That I don't know that you've shared that before, but that personal drive from you was evident in the passion and dedication that you brought to this work. And I just want to say, as a person with lived experience participating in this, you really helped translate what I was trying to express and say, and putting them into these guidelines. So I just really appreciate that. Beth, you and I have been bumping elbows for the past little while in a few different places. So we'd love to hear from you why the topic of peer support for this particular community is important to you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Larissa. I know we only have a minute here, so I'm going to make this really short. I think for me, it all started, obviously, I'm a serving police officer and I see the value of peer support in many different aspects. But for me, early on, I grew up in a policing family. My father was a police officer for 30 years, and you can imagine that was back, you know, in the 70s when we look at stigma. There was a lot of stigma back then, like no one talked about this stuff. So I think really my passion and my drive to continue this in my organization, or actually even start it in my organization, was those early days having family members as police officers and not having that connection. And I remember saying to my dad once I became a police officer and he was still like he had 3 years left in his career, us meeting car to car one day, doing peer support, believe it or not, and asking him during his career, like, did you have anyone to talk to, or like, how did this go? And he said, no, like none of this existed. So for me, very personal. And then as I go through my career, married to a police officer, you know, just all those different aspects. And I loved peer support so much from many different angles, providing peer support, getting peer support, training peer support, that I actually went back and was fortunate enough to study the effects of peer support. So I do see it from many different lenses, and I just see the value in it every day. And when I have people come back to me and say, if it wasn't for peer support, I wouldn't have reached out to a mental health professional, it just really solidifies how important this work is. And while my career here, and probably when I retire, I'll still continue to do it. So thank you for having me, and hopefully I can continue on in this group because it's so important.
Thank you for sharing that, Beth. And I got goosebumps a couple of times imagining the pride that your dad must have felt in that conversation. So thank you for that. And certainly, last but not least, Sid, we'd love to hear from you why peer support is so important to you.
Well, thank you for that. And Beth touched on a couple of things that meant a lot to me, because I was involved in peer support back in the early 1980s to mid 80s is when we first started peer support, specifically for police officers who had to use fatal force in the line of duty, and for their members and the families that were walking with them. So as one can well imagine, there are complex difficulties in managing their reactions to those sorts of events. They were given a responsibility and trained to react in a very specific way to very complex situations. And now these very same officers were facing investigations that may potentially lead to their being charged criminally with at least manslaughter as a result of their actions. And they had nobody to speak to, because we just didn't talk about those things in those days. So as a result of a first meeting on January 14th, 1988, with 7 police officers who were suffering of that kind of event, I became very much involved in dealing with officers who were addressing institutional betrayal, perceived injustice, moral injury, and sanctuary trauma, all within that one human bundle. My work over the years has led me to be an author and co-author of 6 books on the subject of peer support work. And many of the people attending today, I hope many of the people attending today, may recognize me as one of the lead facilitators in peer support workshops offered free to veterans and their family members through the Mood Disorder Society of Canada since 2019. So I'm hoping that hundreds of the peer support workers that we've trained over these years as veterans and police officers are part and parcel of the participation today. I'm on my 37th year of experience in being a peer support worker, and I'll continue to do so as long as I can. Thank you.
Sid, thank you for that. A few different things for me. First of all, thank you for your continued work and for probably being a thought leader in peer support, and just some of the scenarios that you kind of shared resonate with me. I have a close family member who is a police officer, and they use the phrase to me or described to me that they are policing a gray world with a black and white book, and that sure hit home for me. And I might be signing up for the peer support training. I need to stay fresh, so you might see my name come across your desk. Okay, so we're interested in hearing more about the current landscape of literature surrounding peer support practices for these types of populations. For example, what are some of the gaps in research? And I know there was a lot of work done in this area to support the development of the peer support guidelines. And so maybe I'm going to tap on Nicole first to talk about, some of the literature surrounding peer support practices.
Sure. Thanks, Larissa. So what I'm going to try and do is give people a flavor of the kind of literature that's currently out there and that was used to help inform the guidelines. Certainly, as the guidelines specifically state, research is in its infancy in this particular area. And I would say that probably the most abundant literature came from U.S. veterans who were receiving peer support through the VA administration. This is a hospital-based setting. It's different from the settings that we were talking about for these guidelines. And certainly, I mean, there were some lessons that we could take away from that group, such as, how you set up for peer support, setting up for success, how to use and apply supervision within the peer support model. But again, a lot of that research was also very implementation based, and implementing in a healthcare system is very different from implementing in a workplace or potentially in community. There were certainly a reasonable number, not a lot, but a reasonable number of studies that would look at individual programs and then assess or evaluate particular aspects of those programs. So, for example, typically a new program, maybe something around reintegrating into the workforce after a leave. So not necessarily broad peer support, but this particular narrow piece. And then an evaluation of, let's say, the training that was provided. A lot of the measures that were used in these kinds of studies were subjective rather than objective. So, asking the trainees if they thought the training was adequate, for example, right? Instead of some sort of more objective kind of measure. Certainly within families, I think I can count on one hand, Larissa, the number of sort of peer-reviewed published reports I found on peer support for families. And they were very much around bereavement programs, not necessarily around other aspects of peer support. And again, they were more descriptive, really in nature. And then I want to turn to what I'm going to call the practice-based evidence. And so there was a reasonable amount of that. And what I mean by that is, having researchers do either surveys or interviews with people who are working in well-established, with a certain amount of longevity, peer support programs, and then sort of bringing in sort of what do people sort of say works well for them. But that applies to that particular context, that particular setting. What they can do is distill that sometimes into some good principles that everyone seems to agree were important. Certainly things like confidentiality in this particular population, hugely important. Certain ethical practices, hugely important. But that's not really about looking at what works for whom, under what circumstance. And so I think, leave it there because I know we only had about 3 minutes. And then turn it over to Nick for his thoughts on the literature base.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm going to echo a lot of what Nicole said, so I'm not going to actually double up. I'm just going to build on what she said because I agree with her. In 2016, by chance, we were asked to do there was a sort of a zeitgeist moment when a series of chiefs came together and happened to ask myself and my lab all at the same time, hey, Nick, we're being offered about a dozen different peer support programs and training programs for our peer supporters. Can you tell us which one we should choose based on their evidence base at the time? And so, like any good prof, I sent my graduate students out to go and scour the literature to bring back a summary report. And that led to something that got referred to as the blue paper, where we came out and said, you know what, we don't have any clear evidence-based guidelines to give you here. We can't tell you that program A is better than program B. And in fact, the literature is very gray here, to build off of the gray piece. And then thanks to some fantastic work that I've been able to do with a lot of people, Dr. Milliard, who's with us on the line, Dr. Jill Price, who's not here with us, Dr. Bob Christmas, we were able to look at a variety of different ways to try and tackle into the missing pieces of the peer support literature. Dr. Greg Anderson led an article that was released in 2020 that did a systematic review of peer support focused programs all around the world, gathering all the literature that we could find. And you know what we found? We found that there is still no way in 2020 for us to differentiate between the programs. What we were able to do, though, thanks to a variety of different efforts, was to essentially identify the same kinds of challenges that we identified in 2016, but we were able to put some more finite pieces on it. There's a lot of models of peer support. So peer support is a highly diverse thing. When you say peer support, you could be meaning a whole lot of different things. There's inconsistent definitions, there's inconsistencies with standards or absent standards that everybody agrees on. And part of the problem is that peer support is so diverse. Creating standards for peer support means creating a myriad kinds of standards for a diversity of peer support. Like this expounds a huge set of problems. For your researchers, there's problems with fidelity. There's problems with methodological limitations when we try and stand up the research programs to do this to help. And if I dare to step out a little bit and take a small risk here, there have also been serious problems when the research teams, and we've heard this from research teams across the country, have tried to do research in the proliferation of persons offering peer support, and in some cases offering it as part of a revenue stream for a for-profit or a not-for-profit agency, has meant that they're not always willing to engage with the researchers in the way that we need so that we can begin doing the tests that would benefit everybody. So those kinds of border guarding situations, I understand at conceptual levels why that's important, but it really is also limiting our capacity then to give you the very answers that you very much are all asking for. Should we do A or B or C? We need to tease that apart. So I think those are some of the research challenges, and that's before we get into nuances about everything from training and supervision to who should be selected to who shouldn't. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think the guidelines have made a huge amount of progress. We've started to identify the landscape, and so I'm very optimistic that going forward, if we all choose to build a better future for peer support together, that we can. And in the interim, we have fabulous peer supporters across the country who are still doing their very best to provide much needed support for those who serve. I'll sort of stop there, Larissa. That's a lot of lecture.
Great, thank you both for that. So my internet's a little bit glitchy where I am. I have a fear of my face freezing in a really unattractive thing. I'm hoping no one's going to be taking screenshots of that. And if I do end up getting quite glitchy, I will turn it off so you folks can hear the Zoom info. So yeah, thank you for that. Hearing that, yes, there's the research on peer support is in its infancy. There's so much to capture and to research there. And from you know, the lived experience perspective, someone who's delivered peer support before, there's certain things that I wonder how you would research and how you would capture them. So yeah, I'm going to move on to the next question because I'm already frozen. So no screenshots, please, folks. I might be receiving some, type of bribery stuff in the mail. I don't know. Anyways, okay. So, so the next question I'd like to ask, the PSCN reviewed evidence summaries and was asked to fill in some of these gaps based on their lived expertise. However, there were points of contention on what constitutes best practices. What areas of best practice peer support still need more clarity? So with that, I think I'd like to ask Sid, what areas of best practice for peer support still need clarity from your observation and experience?
So, I mean, we could certainly answer this in many different ways, but I wanted to choose this particular concern, and this is the gap and how some organizations look at only some levels of the spectrum of peer support, not all levels. In other words, they pick for them what works well for them or what they need, and might potentially ignore some of the other useful levels of the spectrum. So many organizations are still struggling with the structure of member support required for their members. They think that all support has to be formal, with a methodology that measures some sort of return on their investment. Because of the nature of our work, we often are finding ourselves facing internal conflicts, and as such, we struggle with the trust of the process. And that's from the perspective of a member who is dealing with traumatic events. A wellness program that only provides an organizationally structured formal peer support program cannot provide the support that only an informal support can provide. And that's why we have to be able to recognize that, as just alluded to by Dr. Nick and Nicole, we can't really look at it as just this way or that way. And by informal, I mean that of a team of skilled, lived, experienced peers, supported as well by mental health workers, but who do not report to the organizational structure. An example is an incident that occurs that is traumatic. Everyone clearly feels comfortable accepting the support of the organizational wellness program that's available. And they're okay with that. But then we have an incident occurs that is equally as traumatic, but does involve some question as to the legality of the actions taken by the members. And so an internal or even external investigation is initiated. So who do these involved members turn to for support when they cannot trust the very same organization that is now investigating them, and they are bound by an oath of secrecy as well? This is where informal peers who walk the same path can be of help. As long as the result of our best practices only recognizes formal peer support work and something that is measurable, then we are missing the value of informal peer support that might not be as measured, but be just as valuable. Thank you.
Yes, we certainly had a lot of discussion on informal versus formal support, and you're right. I think there's a lot of different kind of formats, I suppose, or ways people can implement or what peer support looks like. So Beth, I wondered if you had any additional thoughts on that. What areas of best practice peer support still need some more clarity or fleshing out?
Again, trying to keep my answer under 2 minutes. One of the things, and I think I might address one of the questions in the chat when we look at involving clinicians. And I think there's still that, again, gray area out there of when do we bring in clinicians and should we have clinician oversight and all that kind of stuff. So again, depending on the organization, depending on budgets, depending on previous work with clinicians. And I think although the guidelines actually talk about the 3 different levels of peer support being peer-led, peer clinician-led, or strictly clinician-led. What I think is, and I know it touches on a bunch of the stuff with the clinician, but it's very hard when we have organizations that have limited budgets, and you hear about those people doing peer support off the side of their desk. And I remember hearing a lot of that within organizations. So I'm a police officer, I'm a firefighter, but then I was tasked with, creating a whole peer support and training them. So when we look at that and we look at clinicians not being brought in because of different things, or even bringing that outside perspective in, being a person that created peer support in our organization, with clinician support, without and with clinician support, so both areas. I believe that having a clinician part of the peer support, and doesn't mean they have to be inside your organization, but to have that person to be available is super important. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing, without really going into all the training, is again, are the standards. So not necessarily, I know people are looking, well, where do we get certified as being peers? And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more about training standards. So if I, being a police officer at York Regional Police, can go somewhere and get the exact same training an officer in Sault Ste. Marie would get. And the reason why I bring that up is, like I think Sid alluded to, not many, besides inside the organization, some people don't want to get peer support from within. So they want to reach out to somebody outside. And it'd be nice to have, we know that every peer supporter is getting the same curriculum, they're being trained the same way. And then going back to Dr. Carlton's perspective about research, that's where we can start researching when when it's more consistent. And I think having those training standards may be a starting point for that as well.
Great, thanks, Beth. And I think if folks knew there was kind of a standardized training, it might put folks at ease, so they would know what to expect when they're stepping forward from peer support. So yeah, we do have some ways to go there, though. So thank you. And Nicole, I'm curious if you have any insights on this based on like the litany of research and reading that you did. Do you have any observations on what best practices in peer support still need more clarity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was, certainly after the peer support community network had reviewed evidence summaries, I would say that we were able to get to like quite high level consensus around what things are important for peer support, but where there are gaps is how does that actually then get operationalized? And both Sid and Beth have already mentioned this in their remarks, which is that it's the diversity of how people are delivering peer support. They might be delivering it in very different ways. There might be limitations in terms of budgets, in terms of what you can actually do. So while I would say there was high-level agreement that there should be sort of a licensed or registered mental health professional involved in some way in the program, where there was disagreement is exactly how do you do that? And that's where there's a gap in the literature about what is the best way to do that. Like under what circumstances does this professional need to be involved in this aspect versus this aspect versus the other aspect? And so when people are involved with programs and maybe don't have another experience outside of the program that they're either working within or seeking peer support within, they might have nothing to compare it to. So they might even think, you know what, this seems to be working well for us, but I don't know what it looks like on the other side, and there's no research to guide me in that practice. So that's sort of how I saw some of the gaps. Again, I thought we were able to come to consensus on pretty much everything, but it was really high level. It was more once you get down to the specifics that we started to see some gaps and differences.
Great, thank you for those observations, Nicole. As we mentioned before, these guidelines might be used as a starting point for creating new peer support or programs or organizations. They can also be used by existing practices to evaluate and refine their programs. So I'm curious, what are some of the implementation barriers for access or implementing these guidelines, and how can they be addressed? So Sid, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's the example, that is offered of it, the peer support training for the first iteration of peer supporters can be challenging to determine who trains them. And I just want to offer an opinion on that. If no training exists to start the ball rolling, then using the information of how the mind works and reacts to trauma by a mental health worker, validated throughout the presentation with examples by a lived experience peer who presents along with the mental health worker. And that's a good basis to touch upon most, if not all, of the objectives of good peer support training. It's a safe approach. And I think that most organizations would do well if they have nothing to start with. That's a good start, in my opinion. But in addition to the foundation pieces of peer support work and learning to react to trauma, it's important to touch upon those subjects that are specific to the work that we do as veterans or first responders. If we stick strictly to the objectives identified for good peer support training and do not supplement that training with work-specific issues, we miss an opportunity to do better in our training. So talking about and discussing, for example, sanctuary trauma, anger and perceived injustice, moral injury, are all important to know about and understand, with examples specific to the work environment of those being trained, not only by the members, but by their families as well. In addition to these subjects, there's also the issue of trust between the mental health worker and the peer support workers, specifically with issues where, confidentiality and investigations of the member's behavior may be involved. There's no greater gift that an organization can give than to have everything a mental health worker shares based on solid academic research validated by lived experience peers. That's how I wanted to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Sid. Yeah, there's certainly that synergy there. And as I said, I found that working on this project and appreciated that lived experience is so intentionally included in this. I think it's important to hear from those, as I said, kind of at the coalface. There's certain observations, experiences, realities that we can bring to the table to kind of augment it with what researchers, academics, leadership, clinicians can offer. And so, yeah, I appreciated that perspective. Beth, did you have any additional thoughts on that? What do you think some of the implementation barriers might be, and any thoughts on how we could address that?
So obviously, and we get this all the time, it's budgeting and it's time, especially in the policing world. There's so much training that we have to oversee. So my thing too is peer support is driven kind of like the boots on the ground. However, you do need buy-in from that senior management. And thankfully, over the years, we have seen that. I know anytime I've gone out and talked to people about peer support and how important it is, you always get people, well, if we put money towards that, where are we gonna see the difference? So really encouraging people to take that proactive approach. And I always tell people it's very, and I apologize now for using mostly policing terms, but I tell people it's like community policing. Like, how do you look to see if peer support's working? So it was really hard at first to get that buy-in to be, okay, let's look at peer support as proactive versus a critical incident happens and now the team has to swoop in and peer support a critical incident. So really turning our minds to the proactive part of it was super important. And then to take that even a step further, we often look at peer support as, okay, something's going on and that person needs peer support. Where also I think organizations have to look at it as like, okay, we create a team, somebody's going through something, they need peer support, but actually using the peer supporters for people who are doing well, get them and, so I guess my point is here is organizations have to not just champion mental health, but also be creative when they're creating peer support, especially because, again, when we look at that budget line. So as long as we have that buy-in, and one other specific thing I know an organization is having a procedure, creating a procedure that talks about what peer support does and what peer support doesn't. And lastly, for those organizations that are smaller, there's always the option to go to your neighbor, and it doesn't have to be a police organization. Police, fire, EMS, paramedics can get together and create a peer support. So there's many, and I know because when we created peer support in our organization, it's interesting because we created it, we had nothing to look at. We kind of fumbled through some different guidelines and reached out to see what other people were doing. And then a year later, we actually went around and taught on the lessons learned in the first year of peer support. So my thing is like the networking, get to know other people that are doing peer support, and just get really creative on how you can implement it, especially on smaller budgets.
Thanks, Beth. I appreciate what you were saying, that organizations need to be creative with peer support. Unfortunately, but fortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. An organization can't just like roll out this package and press play on peer support and expect that it might be the be-all and end-all for the folks that they're supporting, whether within a particular organization or, for that matter, with particular individuals. That's what I found with peer support. It's what the peer is walking away from in some ways. But I think that's an important message for organizations to be creative with peer support. And I appreciated some of the examples that you gave. We have about 10 minutes before I want to move into fielding some of the Q&A that's been happening in the Q&A box there. But so I have one last question that I might pose to each of you folks in the last 10 minutes before we move to the next. Now that the guidelines have been launched, what are the next steps to advance best practice of peer support for military veterans, PSP, and their families? So maybe I will kick that off. Maybe Nick. So now that the guidelines have been launched, what do you think some of the next steps are?
I think the guidelines give us a great foundation to go forward, Larissa. I think they've helped to narrow our vision, pardon me, not our vision, narrow the playing field a little bit so we can have a better understanding of what those next steps look like. But from a real boots on the ground, so to speak, perspective, I think one of the things that we need to get a handle on are the kinds of nuances that Nicole mentioned. So at a high level, everybody agrees that confidentiality is important. Great. So let's bring together a team of subject matter experts from across the country and beyond, and let's pick confidentiality. I'm just picking one. Pick confidentiality, and let's hammer out the nuances of what that means under the different possible circumstances, and then move on to the next step. I think that would be a really productive way to go forward at this point. That can happen in synergy with research as we go forward.
Thank you. Nicole, curious if you have any thoughts on that, what the next steps might be.
Yeah, well, I think, Nick, I would absolutely echo what Nick said, that the guidelines provide a really good foundation going forward. But I think one of the bigger gaps for me, as well as sort of obvious through the PSC and discussions, was really trying to land on, so what, if we're going to evaluate, what outcomes do we measure? And because there are vast differences in some of the sort of specific goals around peer support, there are vast differences in how people measure. I know that Ontario had sort of done a bit of scoping around whether or not it was possible to create some kind of evaluative framework that could give people some clear sort of high-level outcomes, as well as ways to measure those things. So is this always going to be a subjective, or is there an objective measure that you could potentially do as well? Obviously, we know that, we've said in the guidelines that the gold standard is to go out and engage, a researcher with the right skills and background to do an independent sort of third-party evaluation that you can use as a learning experience to improve what you're doing, not, to say we won or we lost, but as an improvement piece. But again, not everyone is going to have the funds, at least in the near term, to do that. And so if we could create some kind of framework that people could use to guide their evaluative efforts, again, with particular kinds of measures that we could help them to choose from, I think it would go a long way towards advancing the field.
Thank you for putting that there. I know there's a lot of curiosity and questions whenever we've spoken to the peer support guidelines or peer support in general about that evaluation piece. So thank you for addressing that. Beth, do you have any thoughts on this? What are some next steps that you might foresee?
Yeah, so just going back to what I said about the training standards, I would it'd be nice to kind of go in that direction, especially like I said, so something's consistent. I like that. The other thing too that I really appreciate and I think was very beneficial for us early on was to do the safeguarding. So people are psychologically, they see a psychologist or they see a mental health professional before they go on the team. And then have those check-ins. So even when we look at evaluation, we could even be evaluating the experiences of a peer supporter from that lens, possibly, because I think that is super important because we look at obviously providing peer support, but also making sure our peer supporters are looked after. And it nice also to look at, like we look at Sid, who's been in the game for a long time, but also has peer supported a lot of people. So how do those people stay resilient? And which is great. And how do we keep supporting the peer supporters as well? So I would like to see that.
Fantastic. And I think you just set yourself up to answer one of the questions that was popped in the Q&A. So I might be coming back to you in a minute, Beth. So thanks. And certainly, Sid, I would love to hear your thoughts as well on possible next steps for advancing best practice of peer support.
Yeah, so now that the guidelines have been launched, I've been involved in training for a long time. And one of the things that I find very difficult is when people say, but what if? And what if? And, you find yourself doing the best that you can in terms of offering the training and the subjects and the objectives that you want them to hear about and to learn about. You do the best that you can, but you really don't know that you've hit all the marks until they've lived it for a little while. I really think that now the guidelines have been launched and we're hoping people will make use of it because it's a fantastic culmination of a lot of research out there. And I love the guidelines in terms of how they've been presented. It'd be nice for people to come back in about 6 months or a year's time, researched, of course, on the basis of, well, here's what I learned as a result of the guidelines, but here's my reality because of that spectrum that people are facing. Here's my reality that I would like to discuss that people should know about. And then we could look at those gaps between reality and the theory that we're offering and saying, is there something more that we need to talk about when we talk about training and bringing peer support within the organization?
Yes, thank you. This was a national effort, to kind of arrive at consensus on different things within the guidelines, as Nicole was talking about. As you're saying, now it's time to kind of implement them, put them into practice, and then come back and do that systems of checks and balances. Way back in the day, I was in nursing, and certainly what I learned in the classroom taking notes was different than what I encountered kind of in practice in the field. And so I think that might be the case here too, is to hear from those who are implementing and practicing, to kind of come back to this. And I thank you for encouraging us to have these continued conversations and kind of evaluating this piece of it. So I want to thank all of you for the insights on the questions that I just posed to you. I think I'd like to move forward with to the participant Q&A portion. There's been lots of activities there. And I just want to say to you folks that are sharing your reactions as the speakers are talking, thank you very much for that. I know for myself, it's always helpful to see that, what I'm saying might be resonating with folks or have, queries or whatever. So please keep those reactions coming as well. So I want to thank all of you who have been submitting questions and conversation in the chat, and those who submitted questions in advance of registration. So maybe we will move on to some of those questions. And Nick, I'm going to read it off here. I think I'm going to put you on the spot first. Maybe you could initially field this one. Is there a tendency to view and try to measure peer support programs with the same lens as clinical programs? Are there pros and cons to consider with this? And is the paradigm with peer support so different that the traditional research for clinical program limits or narrows capturing and understanding the value of peer support? So let me know if there's any portion that you'd like me to go back to or repeat.
Ooh, okay, so we could probably do 9 hours on those questions together. So I'm going to see if I can just compress it. I think there may be a tendency, but I think there's a tendency to push back against the idea of adding of various levels of rigor that we add to peer support research. And I can understand that. And I think there are some compelling arguments that have been made about that, certainly by Sid and by Beth over the years, by many people. When direct or indirect resources suddenly become needed for training or delivery, or then all of a sudden the conversation shifts with peer support. So as soon as you go and you ask for money, or as soon as you need indirect resourcing or time, or as soon as something goes wrong and you had applied a peer support, then all of a sudden the demand for that clinical level of rigor and lens on peer support becomes very astute. And so I'm not saying that that's good or bad. What I'm saying is that part of our challenge is recognizing that peer support is going to have an emergent impact on the organization. And measuring that emergent impact is difficult. This is why I agree the outcome measures, I think Nicole was spot on there. Like, let's get to some outcome measures that we all agree are good. I also think we need some parameters to understand what we're expecting out of peer support, and that those need to be flexible depending on the size of the organization and the resources. So yes, and I think it's important that we don't dismiss that out of hand, but I think we need to scale it and scale the expectations for what we can do there. The pros and cons there are, if we could ever get there to the same level of rigor, I think we'd be in a fabulous position for peer support if we had that level of rigor for all the different kinds of peer support and delivered in all the different ways. But good heavens, I'll be long retired before we have that kind of research evidence available. So we got to keep going while we're doing it. And I guess, is it different? Is it so different from clinical programs? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's highly complementary, but I think that's, and I'm eager to have any of my colleagues on the line disagree with me, but I think it's quite different. I think what we're expecting a clinical person to do with respect to interventions is very different in many ways than what we're expecting a peer supporter to do. I think they're very complementary, and I love it when they work well together. But as a clinician myself, I've never put on the uniform. I've never served. So I'm limited in how I can communicate. And a peer support provider has, but there's going to be limits that they will have and that they will want, how far they're going to go clinically. That's why I think they work fabulously synergistically when we can make that happen. But I'm eager to be corrected by any of my colleagues or to have that challenged as well.
Yeah, great observations there. And certainly, as I mentioned, my experiences from the lived experience piece of it and receiving and delivering peer support. And I could not put my finger on what makes it work. To a certain degree. Peer support is organic, peer support is natural. Sometimes it's just about holding space for someone. And so you want to keep that beautiful, organic, natural piece without over, you mentioned the word rigor, and that almost is in some ways maybe counterintuitive. I don't know. That's just my own 2 cents, and maybe I'll be fired as a facilitator because maybe it's not about my 2 cents. But I'd like to pass that over. Are there any other panelists that would like to answer this particular question as well? Any compelling thoughts that you wanted to share, or feel open, as Nick said, to disagree or offer a different perspective?
Actually, oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, Sid, go ahead. Oh, okay. Yeah, really quick to add to that too. And I know when I did my dissertation on the effectiveness of peer support, this came up too, as I think if you're coming from the mental health side, we have to consider too, like peer support isn't, some of it's not from the clinical side. Like it's just as Dr. Carlton said about, I don't wear the uniform, I'm not sure. So a lot of what I learned in my research is a lot of the stressors come from the organization. Not to say people aren't affected by what they see on the streets and the trauma, but we sign up to know what we're getting into. But when people feel that organizational betrayal or sanctuary trauma within the four walls of an organization, they didn't sign up for that and they don't know what that feels like. So I know in my research, I looked at the perspective from the peer supporter and said, basically, you peer supported people, what did that look like for you? And what was the outcome when you peer supported? And a majority of the responses back were from stuff that happened inside the organization, not, I went to these horrific calls and this is how I felt. So then again, very hard to do that evidence, collect that research from a clinical perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well to all of what's been spoken to before. As a peer support worker, I've never looked at the reactions of my peers in relation to a traumatic event from a clinical perspective. I've always looked at it from the perspective of being in the trenches with them. And I've described some of the symptoms that they go through as being, I have a fear of having to make that decision again. I have some difficulty with how safe my family is now that I've been involved in something like this in this community in which I live. I really am struggling with how the media is portraying what I did, and I can't speak because I'm under investigation. All of those kinds. So those are the symptoms that are not in the DSM-5, but these are the reactions of real life for peers. And they want to be able to speak to someone who's walked in those shoes and has an appreciation for, holy crap, it really does feel bad being front page news for a week and not being able to say anything to defend yourself based on everything that's being put out there. But the clinician can address, the fact that you are physically and mentally affected by it with some with some treatments that I can't come up with, but I can certainly be the person that says, I know how bad it feels. I want you to know you're not alone. I want you to know that if you go to a mental health worker, we may be able to get the treatment that you need in order to get better. And I'll walk with you in order to do that. And that is a big distinction between one and the other. And I think that they can work very well together.
Sid, what you're saying is really resonating with the participants. I saw lots of responses and reactions, and absolute support, agreements, appreciating you validating that, the value of that and the position. So thank you for sharing that. And maybe we'll kind of continue along that line of trust, pulling from another question that was submitted. And thank you folks for that. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible. Maybe I'll first pose this to Nicole, because it's specific kind of within the guidelines, but then love to hear again from other panelists. How do the guidelines address the trust issues that public safety personnel have with formal organization implemented peer support programs, and as cited in some of the literature? So yeah, let me know if you want me to repeat that, but yeah, how do the guidelines address the trust issues PSP has?
Well, certainly from the point of view of a few key points that are covered off in the guidelines around the ethical issues that are clearly there. So confidentiality being one of the key ones. If you can't maintain confidentiality, you will have no trust in that program. There was an awful lot of discussion at the PSCN around what trust means as well. For people, it means a high quality service that's credible. And that means that, we've brought up many of these issues over the course of this webinar, right? That means that people want to know that folks are adequately trained. Okay, well, then what does that mean? For different programs and services, what is the adequate training? People want to know that, particularly within workplace programs, that people are doing this for the right reasons, that they're being altruistic and giving of their time. Because people pointed out that a lot of the qualities that make somebody suitable for peer support are the very same qualities that potentially get them promoted, right? They're going to be good at leading teams. They're going to be good at managing. They're going to be good at all of these things. We want to make sure that the people are there for the right reasons. And certainly, and I think, Lewis, I probably ask you to repeat just the last bit of the question, because I think that was the first bit of the question. And now I can't remember.
So you're wanting me to multitask and scroll through back to, okay, no problem. How do the I'm glad that my screen isn't on. You guys can see like the confusion and mayhem that's happening back here. Okay, how do the guidelines address the trust issues PSP have with formal organization implemented peer support program as cited in some of the literature?
And and then the one last thing, thanks for repeating that I would say is clearly this was a discussion item for the PSCN, and I think people did come down to consensus on this. There clearly has to be the ability to seek support elsewhere, and this needs to be condoned. This needs to be supported. As Beth already mentioned this, if you don't want to get, and Sid mentioned this as well too, like if you don't want to get support within that organizational program, what are your options? And there should be no judgment around that. It should just be standard, what people are offered. You want peer support? You know what? Here are 3 additional programs that we know of that we think are high quality and good for you to seek that's not our organizational program. So I'll leave it there and see if anyone else has anything to add.
I would like to add to that, if I may. Peer support programs within the organizations need to be built by the people for the people. I can give you an example specifically, which I won't, of course, I don't want to identify anybody, but I know of an example specifically where the chief of an organization wanted to develop peer support program and identified who he thought would be good peers within the organization. It was a bombshell. Right, so we went back to the chief and said, let the people pick their own people. They know who they can trust. And then train them and then put the resources into supporting them. And they did, and they did very well. It is about us trusting each other. It's about us helping each other. It's not about, a police chief being able, or a police chief, paramedic, fire chief, whatever, the person in charge turning around and saying, I'm going to check the box to say that I formalized a peer support program with the organization and it's going to work. It's not going to work if it's not people chosen by the people for the people.
And I'll just quickly add to that too, is again, this is where you look at how your people are picked within an organization. The other thing too, I think is super important is that if you are starting a peer support, and I know we did it in our organization, is that we went and educated the people. We have a fairly big organization here, and I always say if people don't know what's going on, they make it up, and the stuff they make up isn't positive. So having that piece ahead of time, going around, this is what we are, this is what we're doing, this is the point of it. And I think, you know, setting those standards or educating people ahead of time, I think is super important because you're right. Some people, it's not going to be a perfect system. There's going to be people on the peer support team that people don't like. So you're never going to get 100% buy-in that way. But I really think how you pick them, and there's different ways, nomination and that kind of stuff, as well as that whole education piece on why they're doing it and what the peer supporters do, and spelling that all out.
Beth brings up a good point, and I just want to add to that. Over the years that I've been doing peer support work, I have had people that said, yeah, I don't really want to talk to you, Sid, because for whatever reason. But the nice thing is that I knew peers that they could trust or they felt comfortable with. So it's not that important for us to believe that, you know, everybody will want to speak to us, but for us to at least know who else is out there that they can speak to and make that offer without any offense being taken, you know.
Thanks. And then if I recall, yes, there was some conversation and I can't remember off the top of my head. You know, humility, I think, is a value within peer supporters. It's not about you, it's about the peer and their needs. So thank you for that. I wanted to, I've seen a couple of comments in the Q&A regarding this. So I'd like to pose this question. And maybe we can start with, maybe we'll start with you, Sid, since you're right here on my screen. So this particular question, looking for some information on any supports available for peer support personnel themselves. This is something I'm very passionate about as well. So i.e. peer support programs, wellness check-ins for the peer supporters. So any information or thoughts on that you'd like to share, Sid?
Yeah, so one of the things that I really think peer support workers need to do is that they need to also do peer support peer workshops or meetings amongst themselves as well. There's nothing wrong with peer support workers meeting and saying, bearing in mind confidentiality, of course, you know, here's what I'm dealing with. I'm struggling with this. Has anyone else got any suggestions on how I might be able to manage this in order to best suit and help the person? So I always believe that, you know, the peer support meetings to support peers is an essential component of work that we do. But peer support workers meeting with other peer support workers to be able to discuss their issues as well is important. Also, I truly believe that there's tests that they can do for themselves just to make sure that they're doing well. Like the post-traumatic growth inventory is a good little test that you can do for yourself every 6 months or so, just to make sure you're on the right side of doing peer support. The balance wheel, you know, how to balance your life and make sure that the balance wheel is there. And then the gratitude exercise, you know, can I name 3 things today that I'm happy about? Is there something that's making me laugh? If you're not laughing anymore, if you've lost your sense of humor, you might be in need of a little bit of assistance in terms of doing your peer support work. So I truly believe that just because you're a peer support worker doesn't mean you don't need peer support. I work with a fellow by the name of Brad Mackay. I'm leaning on him all the time. He's leaning on me all the time. We're doing peer support oftentimes for others, but oftentimes for each other as well. So good question.
Thank you, Sid. Yeah, Beth, did you have any thoughts on that? Peer support for the peer supporters.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always say good peer supporters always have a clinician, whatever that looks like. I think that's super important. The other thing too is I think a good peer support program, depending on who's leading it, like whether it's a civilian, another officer, whatever, that they know that they can take a break, because we often know peer supporters are those people that never say no. And then sometimes maybe don't realize when, you know, they're getting overworked and that kind of stuff. So I think it's really important for that person that is running that peer support to do those check-ins themselves. But also it's okay, as we say, take a knee, right? And if you need a break, you need a break. We find, I know in peer support programs, you get a handful of people that do a majority of the work. It's just, they're very good, they're very credible. But we really want to make sure that people know that they can take a break, and that they really, although it's selfish, they really do have to put themselves first, because they're peer supporting everybody else, that they really do need to look after themselves.
Great, thank you. We're moving along here. Okay, I have another question. Let's see if I can read this out correctly. Okay. We have questions about process and outcome measures for peer support. Someone was wondering if in organizational programs, is cohesion, belonging, and reduced stigma more helpful outcomes than mental health outcomes? So is there anyone that would like to tackle that question?
I can maybe take a stab at that. This is certainly again about you know, what is the outcome of peer support? You know, and the first question actually even addressed some of that, right? It's, do we measure it like a mental health program? Is those the outcomes, or is it other kinds of outcomes? And I think that you know, when peer support is used as an adjunct to other kinds of treatment, you know, it is a relational practice. And you know, hopefully what ends up happening is people end up feeling better as a result of that peer support, whether or not the peer support itself was producing that, or whether it was just, you know, your ability to maybe more closely follow your treatment plan, which ended up working a little bit better. You know, it's again, it's about understanding what the goals of peer support are. And different programs are going to have different goals. And so things like cohesion, you know, Nick mentioned this as well. I mean, if this is at the agency level, you know, if you're actually trying to create a workplace culture that is more cohesive, more welcoming, you know, less stigma, these are harder things to measure than, let's say, if an individual is seeking peer support for something, you know, themselves. That might be a little bit easier to measure. But again, unless we have some clear outcome measures, as well as some guidance for people who are delivering programs about how should you best measure that, you know, people are still going to be a little bit in the dark. And I think that process measures, to my mind, are usually more about implementation of a program. How well is the program being implemented? You know, do we have the right processes in place to support the work that we're doing? And the outcomes are really, you know, what's the value? Like Sid said it, like, am I getting value for my time or my money if you're paying for it? Or, you know, so what was in it for me? What benefit do I get from it? We need to be clear about what those benefits are as well. So I'll stop there and see if anyone else has anything to add.
Thank you, panelists. Anyone else want to address that one?
I don't know that I could come up with an example of a measure, you know, that could be presented as defending a program. But I do know on a personal level how good I felt knowing full well that when I went to work on a midnight shift, if one of my peers involved with the peer group I was with was working that evening or that night as well, I just felt safer on the road knowing that my buddy was there with me. So I would come to work knowing that they were encouraging me to come back to work, to stay at work. That if I got into some difficulty, that they were the first people I could approach. I don't know how you can measure that other than to say that when the 7 police officers got together on January 14th in 1988, we made a commitment to help each other through the trauma we were going through. And I can say that all of us, including myself, retired after full careers. You know, we supported each other through the 20 or 30 years that we had left within our careers. And how do you measure that? I don't know. But I can say that I had a successful career because of peer support, being there for me. And I wanted others to feel the same good feeling I had. And so I would share what I learned from others. And can we measure that, Nicole, Dr. Nick? I don't know.
Wise words, Sid, is all I have to say. Very wise words.
I agree. I mean, we can always create ways to measure stuff, Sid. That you must know that about me by now. But yeah, some of it's going to take a lot longer though. If you want us to do career measurements, that's a very expensive longitudinal study. Happy to do it. We're probably going to need $30–40 million, but happy to do it.
Thank you, folks. We're coming close to our end of time, and someone is singing my song in the Q&A there, so it's more of a comment, but I'm going to read it out, and it might generate some conversation here. We've touched on it, but I'd like to hear some of your thoughts as the panelists. The comment is, I'm thankful to have heard you're cognizant of the importance of family peer support as well. We don't always bring a defined benefit to the organization from their perspective, but we are vital. Our training is equally as important too. Thank you for posing that comment. And yes, the focus of the guidelines is kind of, it's about people in uniform, military members, veterans, PSP, but we did address somewhat the family perspective or importance of family support within that. Would love to hear if anyone had any observations or wanted to share anything around the family peer support conversations that we had in the development of the guidelines and beyond.
If I may, I'd like to kickstart this. You know, I spent many years listening to how family members could be advised on how to support their members that were going through traumatic events. And it was my spouse that pointed out to me, but what about me? You know, what about somebody telling me how to live with you, behaving the way you are, struggling with what you're struggling with? Not so much to help you through it, because everybody's focused on that. But what about me? And then we suddenly realized, you know, we really do have to pay attention to making the family healthy. You know, it's like it's like the addictions and alcoholics we could turn to the family and say, you're living with an alcoholic, we're going to make sure that you survive that. But how much of that do we do for trauma survival within the veteran community? And I know that many family members are now taking peer support work because they want to support each other as well, not just the member. You know, so I'm pleased that we're at least having these conversations now.
Yeah, if I might just add, I think it's really telling how little research there is out there on family-based peer support. And so and again, then it's focused typically only on one sort of kind of experience, like bereavement, which is of course a serious, and challenging experience, but it goes beyond that. And one of the things that I thought was critically important in developing these guidelines was to have people who are family members on that peer support community network who could talk about the importance of peer support for their own well-being. And you yourself, Larissa, were able to bring such an incredible lens around how peer support helps families, because certainly, and Sid brought it up as well. I'm quite familiar with the literature on addiction and treatment for substance use. And I know that for a long time, there was essentially nothing done for families. It was about, maybe here's a pamphlet and don't enable or something like that, but really nothing about what the family member themselves was going through, and a recognition that they need support too. It's been a long time coming in that sector, and I think now we're definitely at that cusp with peer support, where we're really truly starting to recognize, and I think very much so for this population, the importance of their families, and the importance not just of helping the family support their loved one, but literally helping that family member achieve their own level of well-being as well. So it was really useful having those family members providing input into this process.
And just to add to that, because I can speak from a couple different lenses, is we always say the family is the first responders to the first responders. And I see it on a platoon that's been involved in an incident and members coming back to work and I'm fine coming back, but my spouse has hesitation of me being here, or my kids. Social media doesn't help with any of that. So even trying to, get the family members to understand that they also too play that role, but there's also those supports for them is huge. And I too agree there needs to be, I know there's a lot of great research being done right now, but there definitely needs to be more. And I'm just glad that that was made a big part, but part of discussion in creating these guidelines, which I think is super important going forward.
Thank you for that, Beth. Nick, anything that you want to add on the family component? We've heard from our other panelists. Any observations, experiences that you'd like to share?
I'd echo them. I also think we're seeing an explosion of family research and focus on the families, thanks to groups like the PSP Net Families team and the Garnet Families team. But I really do think we're seeing a lot of leadership in that area. For a decade or more, we heard Dr. Heidi Cram at every single conversation. Anybody who's been in a conversation with Dr. Cram say, and families, and what about the families? And so there's been a great many people across the country that have put forward on that. So I'm excited to see the gains made for families in the coming years, and I have high hopes.
Great, thank you for that. That seems like a really great place to kind of end and maybe wrap things up on. This has been such a great conversation. I'm almost hesitant if I ask another question, we could be here for another little bit. So I do want to be respectful of folks' time. So I just want to thank all of you for your attendance and participation today. Again, for the activity in the Q&A, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but thank you for the conversation there, the questions, for you being interactive in this webinar today. I think that's where the most robust learning and conversations happen, is when you folks, even though we're not seeing every single one of you on the screen, are participating, and even with the reactions that you're sharing now. Thank you for that. Thank you for the interest of peer support and the peer support guidelines for being there. So to our panelists, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. Again, I always learn from all four of you folks and hope I continue to have that opportunity. After this, we'll be distributing a survey for your feedback in order to improve future experiences and gain any insights you may have about the guidelines. As I said, the intention for this guidelines is for you. That was why they were created, for you to have that point of reference, to start conversations, to start that mutual support. I began this webinar today talking about how it's incredible when support organizations are supporting each other. We have a universal goal in mind to better the mental health and wellness of military members, veterans, and first responders. The ultimate goal for them to live long, happy, and healthy lives together with their families. That's what we're all here for. And that's what the guidelines are aiming to help us do collectively. We'll also be sharing a recording of this webinar, which will be available online at the Atlas and CIPSRT web pages. Thank you for the notes, people. It's the first time I got a chance to say CIPSRT. The whole rest of the time I had to say the whole thing out loud, which was a mouthful. I dare you people to say it 3 times fast. Anyways, there'll be the recordings will be on the web pages. And if you'd like to rewatch or circulate to others who were unable to attend today, please do so. So thanks again to everyone. Have a great day, and thank you for doing what you do.